It is now 10 o'clock Ethiopia time, 7 o'clock UK time, so we're going to start the webinar. So welcome everyone, thank you very much for joining, and I'm very excited to have a packed hour and a half of discussion on market systems development in Ethiopia. My name is Adam Kessler. I'm going to be your moderator for the next hour and a half, just to introduce our panelists, to keep the time and to get the discussion going. But I'm going to start off by saying firstly, Salam Nachu, and Metachu, with apologies, but my Amharic is now rusty because it is a few years since I've lived in Ethiopia, but I still miss it a lot. And so it's nice to see so many familiar faces actually on this webinar. So the webinar purpose is really to introduce the idea of market systems development in Ethiopia, based on the work of some of the organizations which have been implementing market systems development projects for years. And we're going to understand better, what does market systems development look like in the Ethiopian context, and how we can use it to best support Ethiopian markets to create jobs and raise incomes. This is the basic kind of question that we want to answer today. So we have 4 speakers. I'm going to introduce them in order. Firstly, we have Ben Taylor, the CEO of Agora Global, a consulting firm working in market systems development. So can you say hello, Ben? Good.
Hello, hi.
Great, thank you. We have Nebil, Nebil Kellow, a partner at First Consult and managing director of Enterprise Partners. Hi, Nebil, you can just wave.
Good morning, everyone.
Great, thank you. We have Maurice Koppes, Program Manager of ICCO STARS, a Dutch NGO implementing programs in Ethiopia.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
And finally, we have Melaku Yirga, the Country Director of Mercy Corps Ethiopia.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
Good, thank you, everyone. And we also have Linda Johannes, who has been instrumental in putting this webinar together and sorting out the admin. So thank you to Linda. Great, so we're going to go straight into it. Or actually, before we do that, I'm going to ask everyone to use the chat box. So we are going to invite your questions and your participation throughout this webinar. Let's start by everybody going to the chat box, which should be in the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see it, click on chat in the bottom menu. You need to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it, not just the panelists. And can you type, say hello, say your name, and say the organization you're from. And I'm going to give like 30 seconds for everyone to do that. Good. Good, hi Asagid, and thank you for your questions in advance. Hi, George. Great, too many people to say hello to, but welcome. And Kwandana Matachu. Remember, if it says to all panelists, then we can see what you say, but the other attendees can't. So if you want to give a message more broadly, you need to select all panelists and attendees. Hey, Mathilde, nice to see you on here. Great. The other function is the Q&A function, and this, when you put something in the Q&A box, it goes not to the panelists, not in the chat box, but it goes straight to me basically, and then I will, if you put a question in the Q&A box, then I will ask it to our panelists. So if you have a question you want answered, please put it in the Q&A box. As practice, can everybody open the Q&A box? You do this by clicking the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and try and ask one question you want answered in the webinar. I will award a prize to the first person who asks a question, and I will give 30 seconds or so for you to ask a question in the Q&A box. So think about one question you want answered in this webinar, open the Q&A function and type it there. Great, we have our first question from Habtamu. who ask, what is the difference between value chain and market systems development? Which is a brilliant question. And as your prize, we will answer that when we get to the session at the end. Everyone else, thank you for your questions and please keep them coming. I think, yes, to introduce the structure, we're going to have first a presentation from Ben Taylor introducing market systems development, and then we will hear from each of our panelists, Nebil, Maurice and Melaku in that order. We're going to pause after each presentation for questions about the presentation, so please type them into the Q&A box, and then at the end we'll have more time for questions. So I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Ben. Please take us away.
Okay. Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Many old friends and hopefully some new amongst you as well. So we're going to talk today very briefly about market systems development as an introduction. So we will cover what is MSD, and I'll break that down into the three component terms of it. So development, markets and systems in an illogical order. We'll look at some stylized examples from different sectors, and we can later on dig into some real examples through the other panelists and in the Q&A afterwards. And then we'll look at the implications for programming as well, what it means for development and how it might be done differently. This should be very much seen as an introduction, by the way. We're going to dwell on this for around 10 or 15 minutes. And this is a fairly complex approach to development, which should hopefully yield improved results because of its complexity. So taking the first of those three terms then, what is development? It is a kind of an approach that aims to achieve poverty reduction in the broadest sense. There are many different development objectives that are encompassed within development. And this approach can be applied across all of them. It differs from relief in terms of its vision for a sustainable impact into the future, whereas relief aims to kind of address immediate needs. Development aims to leave something behind, which is a different way that things work, so that people can continue to get those benefits from the intervention in the longer term. And I'm sorry to say that over 70 years of what you would call the modern development project, much of our best efforts, of which there have been many, have had a transient small-scale impact. They've improved the lives of the people who they have touched temporarily, but this has tended to subside once the intervention or the organization has moved on to a new problem, a new geography. So MSD, above all else, targets large-scale sustainable impact. So that's development. I think talking about the definition of a market for us is important because we perhaps understand it as something different from what you would instantly think of if you came from an external perspective. So in its simplest form, a market is a transaction with a quality, a quantity, and a price of exchange of the commodity or service or good or whatever you're trying to exchange. So that could be, in the most traditional sense, you have a seller and you have a buyer of goods and services. And we're looking at how much is transacted, the quality that is being transacted, and the price at which it is transacted. But it could also be different. It could be looking at the transaction between a student and a teacher, and you'd have a different outcome that you were seeking to achieve there. Maybe the quality of education, the number of students that are getting education, so looking at the quantity, or the price they're paying to get that education, whether it's in cash terms or in other sort of ways that they pay for that education. It could be about governance between a citizen and an elected representative. So looking at the voice, the power that they have in that transaction. It could also be about environmental protection and looking at a poor landholder and a polluter and the kind of negative transaction that impacts upon them there. Or indeed a patient and a doctor and looking at the medical outcomes. So ultimately what we want to do in market systems development is change those terms, either the quality, the quantity, or the price, or some combination thereof, to make sure that the poor and disadvantaged people that we're trying to assist through our intervention are benefited in one or more of those ways through that transaction. So we're trying to change those outcomes, and those are our key outcomes. And our analysis always starts with the poor and disadvantaged people who we're trying to benefit, understanding the way in which we're trying to benefit them, and then trying to address the causes of that failure in the transaction. So the last component then of market systems development is the system. And the way that we understand that is that transaction in the middle there, the supply and demand, whatever is in that transaction, is supported by a range of functions and governed by formal and informal rules. And those are the key things that determine those outcomes that we just mentioned at the core of that transaction. So each of those support functions, then, if you take any of these supporting functions from the top half of this diagram, or the rules from the bottom half of this diagram, that can be considered as part of its own market with its own transactions, its own supporting functions and rules. So what that looks like then is a complex set of interconnected transactions that actually lead to those development outcomes. So while we might have a principal market there that involves our poor and disadvantaged people, that might lead to another market where you have another transaction, another group of actors, and more and different supporting functions and rules and causes of the constraints to that outcome. And that kind of, can spin out in lots of different directions. Problems usually have multiple causes. So while a poor person whose life we want to improve might live there, on the supply side, say there are a smallholder farmer who's producing goods for the market, the causes of that problem and the way to achieve sustainability and scale in outcomes might not come from giving things to them or training them or whatever, but it might come from addressing problems that are out here or over here. Say that this leads to the problem. The reason they can't get a higher price for their commodity is because of poor road infrastructure. And you look at what causes poor road infrastructure, and you say that the suppliers and demanders of the infrastructure are different. You look at who's paying for it. You look at the finance system that leads to that infrastructure. And maybe your intervention ends up there rather than directly with the poor people. So market systems development in a nutshell then is a rationale. It's why we do it. We want to achieve large-scale sustainable development. We want to change something different to a traditional program, in that we would ask not what do people need and give it to them. We ask instead why the systems aren't providing those solutions to the problems, and try to fix the systems so that those systems continue to provide solutions to that problem. And we have a kind of guidance for action as well. And this may come up when we answer the question about value chains and the difference, is that we try to work with local actors throughout the system based on their capabilities and, crucially, their incentives to change their behavior. And we address constraints at the system level so that those impact on many, many people rather than just the people we directly work with. So we're not working with beneficiaries, but we're working for beneficiaries and for greater numbers of them. Quick stylized examples. How we doing on time? Okay. So I'll run through two quickly here, but this is to very kind of crudely contrast a more traditional direct approach with a market systems development approach. So in the first program, you might have poor agricultural practices among smallholder farmers. The donor funds a local NGO to train 2,000 farmers. After a year, 50% of those trained farmers continue to behave in that way. They learned from the training. 10% income increase for 1,000 farmers is the result after a year. And who does and who pays is often a crucial question we ask. So in that scenario, the donor, the NGO delivers the training, and the donor pays for that training. Contrast that with a market systems development approach. So same problem, poor agricultural practices. The donor in this case funds an MSD program, which then asks a series of different questions. Why aren't farmers getting the quality of information and training that they need to improve their practices? Where do they normally get information from? And why aren't those channels delivering the best access so more people get it? So it's a question of quantity of information or the best content. So it might be a question of quality of information. So it co-funds a new business model pilot with the radio station, because that's where they get the information from, to pay for audience research. That's another function. In order for the radio station to sustainably provide this information, it needs a revenue-based model based on the number of listeners. So the program funds an audience research company to start delivering that as a service, and they sell advertising based on the audience. The agricultural information, because it's what people are interested in, becomes embedded in the programming and it matters to the audience. So after a year, you've got the pilot radio station they work with, 5 other radio stations copy, 50,000 farmers get the information who listen to the broadcasts, and you probably have a lower uptake of practice change, but you're dealing with a much larger number of people. So in that scenario, you've got the radio stations providing the training or information and the advertisers that are paying for it. So even after 1 year, the donor's no longer involved, but this is still happening, and that's the difference. And then audience research is a new function that we've tried to address. Research companies are doing the audience research and radio stations are paying for it. And I think the real difference then comes out when you fast forward that a bit further. So look in 5 years' time. So out of those 1,000 farmers who originally practiced, you've got new diseases, you've got some of them have left the profession, you've got others who just forgot what they were told. So now there's only 500 farmers who are using those improved practices that are still relevant. And 15 years later, there's no new farmers that have been trained. There's no one with the incentive to deliver that training, and no new training on things that have changed in the discipline. So the benefit has effectively subsided. Contrast that with the other program, where after a year you had 5 radio stations. Now you've got 30 radio stations. This model makes sense. Lots more of them copy. Now there's 1 million farmers involved. And out of those 1 million, maybe 10%, maybe 15% actually change their practice and improve their income. Fast forward that another 10 years, and you're talking about the information, because the radio stations depend on the up-to-date quality information in order to keep people interested. They continue to invest in the programming. So the information continues to get updated. Those farmers continue to be productive, receive the information, and now over 7 million farmers have been reached with this intervention. I think I'll skip through this. We can come back to it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've got a few questions from the Q&A that I'd like to ask you.
Okay, so I mean, this is just an example from a different context around how it would relate to a humanitarian setting. So we can talk through that later. So in summary, we've been doing this about 20 years now under this approach. And I can tell you from personal experience, this is working globally. We reach large numbers of people. It doesn't always work. Failure is a kind of key part of the approach. We learn from it. But the numbers are much bigger than you could ever achieve with any other development approach that I have seen. And some of those are there. So ultimately, MSD is an opportunity to reach more people at a lower cost, to fund more relevant interventions that are locally owned always, to develop innovative and large-scale solutions to a wide range of development problems, not just private sector development or income change, and above all, for funding to be spent on sustainable development solutions. So for programming, the beneficiaries are the same. It's about poor and disadvantaged people. It involves many, many more stakeholders. Public sector, private sector, civil society are all involved in delivering these solutions. The implementing partners, many of them are waiting their turn here patiently for me to stop talking. So you have public sector, private sector, civil society, NGOs. It takes a bit longer. You have 5 to 8 year programming cycles typically, with an inception phase, and you don't get results for a little while because you're trying to convince others to change their behavior rather than doing it yourself. All intervention instruments are on the table in terms of technical assistance, research, loans, guarantees, grants, everything. But we try and work with the incentives that people have. So start small and leverage their incentives for change. It's adaptive and iterative, and it's a relatively high expenditure on kind of staff and experts compared to, you know, giving things away. That's kind of a crucial difference. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I think I was about on time. Right.
Great timekeeping. Thanks a lot, Ben. Could you close your present or stop sharing your screen, and then we can see you as much as we would like? Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to go for a couple of questions from the audience, and I'd like to start with Patrick from ICCO Rwanda. So Patrick asks, does it happen in market systems development to give directly? What's the role of providing grants? And I guess another way to ask it is like, what's the role of direct provision of services under market systems development? So yes, Ben, over to you.
So it happens at several levels. I think it's fair to say it's rare if we identify a target group with a problem and we give them something to solve that problem. It happens occasionally, you know, just as development programs are a vehicle for donors to respond to crises, you know, sometimes after a shock event or something, they've just been used as a vehicle like any others to distribute kind of emergency supplies or whatever. But in general, there is a stage when you're trying to prove a step in a theory of change where you might do something directly to generate evidence. So, for example, in Ethiopia, in the Leeway program, we gave subsidy vouchers directly to beneficiaries to test their willingness to pay to put their children into childcare and go back to work. For mothers who had dropped out of the labor force. So for a temporary period of time, we're doing something directly with them to generate evidence on a crucial step of the theory of change. We never plan to do that in the long term. We're using it for our own benefit so that we can then afterwards, and they benefit from it as well. You know, it's not harmful to them, but we do it so that we can then build on it and find a way to get the cost down to a manageable level where they would then use it. With private sector, for example, you look, because it's all about their incentives and capabilities, you might get someone who's been working in another company, wants to start a spin-off, really great knowledge, great technical ability, great appetite, has no track record to start a business and deliver on the solution that they have. So they are very, very capital constrained, but they are technically all their willingness, their desire, their personal motivations, everything is in place. So if you think that this business model is crucial, then you can give them the startup cash. You know, if everything else is in place, you can give them the startup cash. There are other ways to do it. Maybe you think it's better to go with a loan, a shorter term loan or something like that. Because then you're more likely to leverage, you know, if you give someone money, they're probably more likely to go, yeah, well, maybe I won't try as hard to pay it back because there's nothing on the line. But in some scenarios, that can happen. So I think it's all about kind of a nuanced approach to deciding when to use what instrument based on people's capabilities and incentives. Right. But nothing is off the table.
Good, thank you. That's a really helpful answer. We're almost at the end of your time, but I do want to get in one question from Inga from Fair and Sustainable Ethiopia and Getachew Mekonnen. And they ask, is MSD applicable in urban areas? Is it applicable in refugee context? So maybe you could speak briefly about like how widely applicable MSD is.
Yeah, so interestingly, I designed and we're implementing with Mercy Corps and others the Leeway program, which is an urban development program in Addis Ababa. And I also designed, I know we have some callers here, the SHARP program, which works in refugee camps and host communities in Gambela, in Dolowado and Jijiga. So yes is the short answer. There is a much more complicated answer, particularly when it comes to refugee settings, where that context doesn't exist without the aid distortion or the aid input. And so sometimes you can take a market systems approach to influencing the behavior of others, including aid actors. So there are some nuances to it there. I would urge you to look up the SHARP program and the design around that to maybe find out a bit more there. And Mercy Corps also, Melaku could talk about some of the work they've been doing with CEDA in a similar setting. And in terms of urban areas, I think it's absolutely crucial. And it's also comes back to an answer about how this is different to a value chain approach, because in urban areas, you have messy, complex economies. People engage in hustle activities. You know, it is not like saying, all right, we're going to intervene in maize, and here's all the problems with maize growing. In urban areas, people do 100 different activities to earn their livelihood. So we're looking at systems like the labor market. How do they find work, whatever that work is? We're looking at the messy, dirty growth sectors that other people won't tackle, like cement and tissue paper and all those together, and what are the collective constraints they have to growth. And we're also looking at the ability of people to start micro enterprises, whatever they do. So regulatory constraints, access to finance, things like that. So you end up there are differences when you apply it in this way, and that's crucial to the kind of difference with the value chain approach. But I think it is relevant in these settings, and perhaps more so because it's been less commonly applied.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you everyone for your questions. And I should also say, if you have like responses to these questions or your own experience, please share that in the chat box as well. And I think it'll be really interesting for other participants. So we're going to go over to our first experience question, or our first experience section. And I think this answers the question from Asagid, who wants some examples of MSD programs in Ethiopia. And to kick us off, we have Nebil, who I worked with for a long time in Ethiopia. So I'm excited to hear your presentation. Nebil, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. And hi, everyone. It's good to talk this morning. Before I load up my presentation, let me just say a few things before I distract you on my screen. Yeah, so the purpose of my talk is really now to go into, well, there's the theory, but what's the practice? And I think Ben has covered really a lot of good examples, so I'll try not to go over some of those same things. But I want to start with just, I see a lot of the questions, and I want to try and tailor what I'm saying here to what I'm seeing on the chat. The market systems approach is an approach, it's a set of principles. So I see a lot of questions around, can it work in this context, and does it work like that, and whatever. What I've learned from 7 years now of implementing a market systems program is that it's a very good framework of thinking about issues that will come down the road. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and particularly I'll talk a lot about sustainability. You've all heard the phrase, if you want to help a poor person who's maybe living on the side of a lake or a river or something, do you give them fish or do you give them a fishing rod? Obviously you give them a fishing rod because that will give them a chance to catch more fish over time. But what I always like with this analogy is, well, the market systems approach takes that further. What if their fishing rod breaks? Well, how many kilometers do they have to go in order to get that fixed? How do they market the fish? How do they, do they even know how to fish using a fishing rod? So there's all sorts of challenges that come into kind of, making basically that one intervention you're doing of giving a fishing rod. And it's a pretty bad example. If you see the map behind me, we're in a landlocked country. We don't have a lot of fish here, but I'll go with it anyway. And it's about saying, how is what we do sustainable so that we don't have to go back again, and when the fishing rod breaks, give another fishing rod? How do we get the markets to work? But having said that, that's the theory. Now, when we go into the practice in Ethiopia, there's a lot of areas where you've got to take the theory with a pinch of salt. You've got to say, look, I need to adapt. I need to adapt to the context. And I think the market systems approach, more than any other approach I've ever worked on, forces you to have to continually adapt and contextualize what you're doing. So on that note, I'll go into my presentation. And let me just pull up the screen. So I'll start with, let me just maximize this for you. So I'll start with a little bit of an explanation of what we've done. Let me just minimize these Q&As. Okay, So Enterprise Partners is the organization that I've run for the past 7 years, which has just closed. And our basic objective is to put young Ethiopian majority women to work in the manufacturing, in the agro-industrial sectors. And we do it through 2 focus areas. One is directly intervening in the 3 sectors mentioned below, garments, leather, and horticulture, but also tackling the finance and the investment needed. As we know, Ethiopia is an economy that has had a very limited amount of investment, and finance particularly has been a major challenge and continues to be a major challenge. So we've said we cannot intervene in these sectors unless we do something systemic also in the financial sectors. Okay, so how do we do it? I won't go too much into the theory, but ultimately we're looking at poverty reduction as our goal and really reaching the poor. And I saw some questions about, how do you really reach the poor? You can see there's a big gap between what we do, which is at the bottom, the market system change, and the end goal, poverty reduction. And there's a lot of people in the middle, and there's a lot of steps in the middle. And the first thing that you have to understand then in the market systems process is that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience, because you are facilitating merely. You're paving the way for your exit. You're paving the way for 7 years from now when you're going to be out of it. Have you facilitated other people to do things that they'll continue to do after you're gone? Is what they're doing sustainable? Is it scalable? And that takes, as I said, a lot of patience, not just from the implementers, because I think as long as the implementers have their funding, they'll continue to work at this with a lot of passion like we did. But from a donor perspective, it requires patience, and it requires a very good sense of that results will come after the program has ended, probably more than the results that would come during the program's life cycle if it's genuinely systemic, because it will have taken time, and ours was a 7-year program. These slides are going to be available afterwards, so I'm not going to go through every single point. Just to give you a sense of the scope of our work, we work in 13 markets, and those are the ones that you see on the right-hand side of the screen: cotton, textile, apparel, raw hides and skin, RHS, tanning, etc., across 4 main sectors: garments, leather, horticulture, investment. And as you can see, somebody said, what's the difference between value chains and market systems? These are a series of value chains, from the cotton to the textile to the apparel to the labor. So we work across value chains, and each node in the value chain we would consider as a market, which is one market system. And so that's quite a lot of different markets we have. We've had up to maybe 70 interventions at one point in time, all running in parallel across these markets to try and get one individual market node like cotton to work, which may have about 15 interventions or 10 interventions. But then obviously the cotton interventions have to be linked with the textile interventions to get the system to work, because any chain is as strong as its weakest link. Okay, so a little bit about results so far to June 2020. We've managed to introduce 39 innovations into the business community in the sectors that we're working, whether it's in the government side in terms of policy innovations, whether it's in the business side in terms of new ways of doing things. We've managed to get so far 118 organizations changing the way they work as a result of those innovations that have been introduced. We've had a lot of direct support, and I'm going to talk about direct support in a minute. And we've also changed rules, whether it's policies, norms, and so on, along that. And that has unlocked so far almost £300 million in investment and £200 million of credit mobilized to the private sector, supporting close to 50,000 jobs and 13,000 women-owned businesses. So there have been results, but like I said, I think we talk about a hockey stick or an exponential curve. We see, and our donor had to have a lot of faith in us, because in years, and Ben was part of our evaluation team, in years 1 and 2, obviously there's very little results, but 3 and 4, there were still very little results. There were early stage results. I'll go back. There were results in the lower parts of this work of the market system changes, facilitation, a little bit around sustainability, not so much scale, not so much poverty reduction. It required a lot of patience. And I would say most of our results have come in the last 1 or 2 years. So that's years 6 and 7. And we've seen an exponential growth. And we expect to see a continued exponential growth. And in fact, we're seeing it, even though the project has been winding down now for the last 12 months. The results have continued to accelerate. And that's what you want to see when you do a market systems project. I'll talk qualitatively as well, because it's not just about the numbers of some of our achievements so far. In the garment sector, we've got a flagship intervention called Hipster, which is a sourcing, screening, training of workers intervention, which has had about 60,000 people so far go through this innovation of how to source workers for industrial parks, which was a huge constraint before, but also how to retain workers in industrial parks. So this has led to, I would say, it's a world first model of worker recruitment from rural catchment areas. And it's like a funnel, basically, pulling workers from up to 200 kilometers away from the industrial parks, screening them at source, and then grading them on different criteria, and then training them ready for the factories, so that more investors basically would be encouraged to come to Ethiopia when they understand that there's a tool that they can use like this to find workers and train workers.
Time check, sorry, Nebil, is you've got about 5 minutes left, and it would be great if we can use some of that for questions.
Absolutely. So I'll leave this up here for the slides, but I'll just mention 1 or 2 more things. In the financial sector as well, we've had quite a lot of success in terms of building an ecosystem for the private equity industry, which was a big challenge, and we're now starting to see private equity investments coming through. In the leather, we did a lot more work on the policy side to unblock some key constraints. So I'll just mention a few challenges and then go into questions. So the first one is market systems projects are well, ours was big, and that was a huge challenge for us. But the complexity of it, it's very hard to communicate, how all these very complicated projects and complicated interventions all fit together, and how a whole market system of 47 different little tweaks and changes is going to result in the benefit of poor people's lives. The second thing I should mention is that institutional capacity we've dealt with along the way has been weak, whether it's in the government or the private sector. And we've had to do a lot of capacity building, which goes against the grain of a lot of market systems development work. But as I said, you have to learn the rules in order to understand how to break them. The third thing, Ethiopia has been in transition. So things have changed, from year to year. It's been constantly moving. So we've had to continually do analysis, reanalysis, reevaluate, pivot and change. And the last thing I would mention is data and feedback. Adam was leading our monitoring and results measurement department, but we don't get always data on a daily basis. It's very hard to make decisions with weak data systems, with weak feedback systems. So we're operating in a sort of imperfect environment. On that, I'll just close and give some time for reflection and questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Nebil. Are you able to close the presentation? And then we can see you. Good. So I'm going to start to kind of merge questions a bit, but I wanted to look at a question from Zudu Samuel, who asks about the role of the public agencies. And his perspective is that often the public agencies and some institutions do not necessarily understand the market systems approach, and maybe do not provide a conducive environment to do business, and how are they best engaged? Hailey also asks a similar question about policy level changes and how can we work on policy level as a market systems development program. And I think I'll add from my experience in enterprise partners with you that the government of Ethiopia often has a very strong vision and a very kind of high capacity in many ways for what it wants to achieve in the area of economic growth. And then this creates great opportunities for a market systems program. So in the Ethiopian environment, how do you work with government? What's the role of the government in your project?
Sure. So I think we have to start with where we've been in Ethiopia, particularly in a country that's followed a development state approach until probably recently. The first thing we have to understand is markets do often fail, right? Any economist will tell you that, and markets fail poor people quite a lot, even in places like America. So there's a lot of skepticism about markets. And I think that's in fact why you need a market systems program to actually talk through how practically on the ground to make markets work for the poor and not just for the rich or for, you know, whoever. But I think we have to engage in that. You know, there's been a lot of work in Ethiopia over the last 30 years around developing infrastructure, developing physical markets, developing also, but the software of economic development, you know, the institutions around market price signals, does supply meet demand quickly, inflation, all these other things, you know, it really hits the ground on the market systems level. And so we did quite a lot of, first of all, work with government on just training them on and training our counterparts on market systems. We sent them on training courses, we sent them material. We had to evangelize about the market systems approach to say this is not about free markets, but this is about intervening in markets in a responsible way for poor people. So that was the basis of the start. And then on the policy side, absolutely, a lot of policy work is required to make markets work effectively. But what we didn't do was become a general kind of policy advocacy lobbying organization. We took the evidence that we were generating, and that's why I talk about data and the MRM systems. Adam, when you joined, you know, we started out with one person as our monitoring and evaluation officer. We ended up with about 9 people in the monitoring and evaluation team because we said we need evidence, we need to gather data and link that to arguments to influence policy. And what we found was that the government was very welcoming of policy interventions that were grounded in data and grounded in evidence. So we put a lot of energy into that because ultimately a lot of problems in the markets that we work in do go back to government decisions and government policies. We've had quite a bit of success in that area.
Great. Thanks, Nebil. Okay, so I think we're going to move on, and next we have Maurice. So over to you.
Hi, Adam. Thank you. So my name is Maurice. I've been living in Ethiopia for over 7 years. And one of the things I've been doing is managing the STARS program that I'm going to talk about. I also had the pleasure to work with most of the other speakers in Enterprise Partners for several years. And that made me also understand the country very well, allowing to take those lessons into the STARS project. So let me open my presentation. There we are. I think you can all see this, right? The same background. ICCO Cooperation is hold on. Hold on.
Good. We can see your screen okay?
The slides don't move for some reason.
Okay, then I'll share my screen. Is it working now, Maurice? Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. So ICCO is a Dutch NGO and has been known in Ethiopia mostly for its brand name Terrafina, and only recently has fully presented itself as ICCO Cooperation. It's the collaboration of Protestant churches from the Netherlands, and at the moment it is in a merger process with Cordate, the representation of Catholic churches, making it together a lot bigger and stronger. Let's move on to the next slide. So the STARS program, a MasterCard Foundation funded program, is active in 4 countries. Though the market systems approach doesn't really need target numbers of outreach, we nevertheless got them. And we are focusing on improving the livelihood of smallholder farmers in these 4 markets: Senegal, Burkina Faso, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. Let's move on, Adam. So the focus of the STARS program is rural smallholders. And in our assessment, what prevents rural smallholders from improving their livelihoods is essentially 2 areas: developments in the value chain and access to finance. If you want to change your livelihood, it almost always requires money. And that's why we are working in those, we are focusing on those 2 areas. Move on, Adam. So here we break it down into the 2 pillars: access to finance and value chain development. In access to finance, we primarily work on agricultural lending. The core constraint, in our view, why agricultural lending is so limited is because MFIs, and loan officers in particular, don't understand the agricultural business. They are very much focusing on collateral and group loans, throwing $50 at all the members, and that's it. In our agricultural loan assessment, we try to push loan officers to truly understand the agricultural business, to understand what is needed to plant, to grow a crop, and to what is also the revenue, what is the cash flow pattern, and in that way, loans are better adjusted to the need, to the working capital need of farmers. Still, agricultural lending is risky, so risk management more risky than urban lending. So risk management, an internal process in MFIs, remains critical, and we support that. Ultimately, to make scale, we involve more and more MFIs, but also we support capital mobilization. And in Ethiopia, that's primarily through deposit mobilization savings due to some restrictions on international borrowings. So we work with behavioral science techniques to improve that deposit mobilization. In the other pillar, value chain development, we work with cooperatives, producer organizations, here called POs. And depending on the value chain that we are working on, we focus on malt barley and potato, but we also work less intensively in other value chains. We look at where the more pressing constraints are. For example, in malt barley, it is really around the input supply, whereas in potato, it is much more access to markets. There are almost no big buyers in the potato market. We work a lot with Sensalet, the potato processor, and we're able to do contract farming with large group of cooperatives. Lastly, business services, advisory services that we promote by bringing up consultants, advisors, who can then ideally at a fee in a sustainable way provide services to cooperatives, for example, to access finance or to access inputs at a fee. Let's move on.
Okay, you've got about 5 minutes left, just as a time check.
Just like Nebil said, monitoring and evaluation, which we call PEARL, Program Embedded Reflection and Learning, is a critical process. So in order to adapt your program, you need to have this organized. We allocate about 20% of our budget to PEARL, to MNE, in order to be as adaptive as we want to be. Let's move on. So maybe we skip a few slides. Adam, let's move on to the next one. It's two friendly boys that just got a loan from an MFI. So a key challenge in access to finance is the lack of a financial market. So capitalization of MFIs is really critical. Deposit mobilization only brings them so far. There's a strong culture of saving in banks and borrowing from MFIs, which makes it very difficult for MFIs to mobilize enough capital. Yeah, let's move on to value chain development. I mentioned contract farming at the input supply market. We work with some of the importers, and it's very critical to also bring the microfinance actors in the value chain, and we do that with our lending method. Let's move on. So some of the challenges that we face in the value chain is partnerships with government. Perhaps ICCO and Terrafina is not well known, not known enough as, for example, enterprise partners, making us maybe face trust issues. But we find it very difficult to enter into PPPs, public-private partnerships, with government bodies that are then working successfully. Yeah, let's move on. Overall, in MSD, what we think is critical is to identify where the opportunity is. So MNE plays a critical role. If we see something is working, we can invest more. We build on that opportunity, and typically it requires partners to have the right mindset. Oh, another presentation. Right. Another important issue is what we call paralysis by analysis, is that we try to understand a market system better and better. And what we learned is that the practice of just moving forward, trying out, building a network is the best way to develop appropriate interventions, trial and error, rather than paralysis by analysis. So a platform of which this session is a good example is critical in Ethiopia, so that many different actors start to understand the approach and the benefits of a market systems approach. Lastly, to find staff is challenging, and more has to be done also through the different implementers to develop a more qualified crowd. Okay, let's move on. I think that's it. Yeah, we can move on to the end.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, Maurice. I'm going to ask one question, and we've got 26 open now, so I'm again going to try and combine, but this question is around the ability of market systems development to reach the poor. So as you do asks, how can it be applied in the remote, rural and marginalized geographic areas? And Timotheus asks, how do you strike a balance between benefiting the poor and changing the system? And maybe a related question is there a trade-off there? So what do you think?
So let me start with that. Subsidies, and Ben talked a little bit about subsidies, can come in many forms, right? If you look at the European Union, for example, I believe 30 or 40% of the overall budget goes into agricultural and fisheries subsidy, primary sector subsidies. That's the largest subsidy program in the world, right? And that means subsidies are sometimes needed. If you now look at safety nets bodegas, PSMP bodegas, quite often there's a search for sustainable interventions in those areas. But if people only have 2 chickens, then how can you run a sustainable business? So certain subsidies, as they are common in the safety net bodegas, are probably needed also in the future. I truly think it's like that. And nevertheless, I think the total budget can be reduced. A number of activities can be more market driven. If you now look at other parts in the country that are very fertile and successful in agribusiness, it can be done without subsidies. Sometimes, as Ben also explained, subsidies are needed to overcome certain risks or to make sure that you don't you get enough buy-in and later phase out those subsidies. Maintaining a certain market segment and adjusting the funds to that market segment. In other words, understanding the business case of the farmer very well and adjusting your program to that, I think that is key for it to work. Adam, you're muted.
Of course, it wouldn't be a Zoom call without that. So thank you very much. We're going to go over to Melaku for the final presentation, and then we'll have some open Q&A. So Melaku, I think you want me to share the slides, right?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Hello, everyone. My name is Melaku. I'm the country director for Mercy Corps in Ethiopia. I just resumed this role more recently, but I've been in the region, East Southern Africa, and where I started my journey, especially with Mercy Corps, dates back a bit longer. So I'm going to briefly talk about, some of our works on market systems over the last good number of years, I can say. I will give you a quick background who we are. Then obviously some of you have really mentioned good points around what it looks like in certain settings. I will give you a brief background on how context matters and how important it is, and then some essential consideration in working on market systems in this kind of settings with some examples from some of our works, and then the lessons we have. So hopefully I will wrap up that in the coming 10 minutes. So Mercy Corps is a global organization. We operate in over 42 countries, 17 countries in Africa. We have a team of over 5,500 people. In Ethiopia, we started our operation in late 2004. Some of our works that relates to markets dates back as early as 2011, but significantly it started around 2013. So when I go through my presentation, I may be mentioning, different examples, just to note that, we have good number of people in this, learning event. So I may not be in a position to mention everyone we partnered with. As you all know, this is a work of multiple partnership, the donors, private sector, government, other civil society organizations, and most importantly, private sector actors. So I may not be able to mention all those, and not to claim that everything done, achieved here is owned and fully attributed to Mercy Corps. That is one of the things, actually, attribution and contribution in market systems development, but you can clearly see. Since 2013, through those different investments I mentioned on the slide, we are able to partner with more than 2,500 different levels of private sector partners, leverage significant amount of private sector investment funding, and impacting millions of people. This includes households and their families, actually. Predominantly, can we go to the second slide, Adam? So predominantly, why I said, context matters, most of our work has been in the pastoral, agro-pastoral, arid, semi-arid areas. These areas are really, very much characterized by thin markets. Issues of food and nutrition security often come as primary objectives. The markets are thin, underdeveloped. Of course, broadly speaking, our markets in general as a country has a long way to go, but it is even more difficult, more complicated when we talk of it in this kind of setting, meaning that you experience lots of disturbance along the way. Conflict, drought, and other externalities. How many of them we are dealing at the moment? Desert locust, flood, drought in some areas, the list goes on. So these aspects are really essential. And what does it take to do market systems in this kind of setting? So I will talk briefly about some of the lessons. So market in a very normal setting is quite different implementing it in such kind of setting. But one thing to note is that our principles, as my predecessing presenters mentioned, our principles remain the same, but we use different tactics. And in market system, there is a continuum of different tactics being used by market facilitators, from TA type role, technical advisory type of role, to a more heavy or slightly heavier investment in the form of financing to stimulate markets, as we see in some of the examples recently. In relation to COVID, as well as in such kind of setting. So what we look at, when we look at some of our works in this kind of settings, what is critical is how do we bring in, okay, we have these recurrent shocks and stress. How are we bringing the resilience lens into it? Meaning that resilience of systems and market systems, as well as resilience of communities. So that is really has to be an integral part of it. And when we talk about markets, Ben has mentioned earlier, it's not just the economic market. There are other issues, the governance, rules of the game, and especially in this kind of setting where people largely depend on natural resource and livestock. So there are aspects that we need to complement and build alongside this investment. So governance and social cohesion were critical parts that we had to consider. And obviously, another critical aspect is crisis modifier. This is a work that has been going on for quite some time with USAID. This crisis modifier idea is, how do we respond when a crisis happens while we are in the middle of implementing or at somewhere implementing longer term investment. This crisis modifier is meant to adjust your programming so that you meet the immediate needs that people are experiencing due to certain shock, but without compromising your longer term investment. Let me give you an example. How can we do cash transfer in this kind of, when a drought happens or when a crisis happens? Rather than direct delivery, you may want to continue partnering with the financial institution you are working with and go for digital financial transfer or go through financial institution. And destocking could be an example. So private sector led subsidized behind private sector subsidized so that pastoralists are able to get market for their herd before they get worse in their conditions. So this destocking, making it through a market channel and private sector investment are some of the things, so that you maintain the development gain as well as you meet also some of the immediate needs of people. So I'm just trying to touch also by expanding a little bit some of the questions colleagues have raised around these issues. Next slide, please. So I think some of us or most of us might remember, the 2014-15 drought, which was substantial, large number of people were affected. This case data point, Nebil mentioned how important it is really to have evidence-based. This data point done by Tango, commissioned by USAID in one of our programs we implemented, funded by USAID, which is PRIME in Somali and Oromia Afar regions, but specifically during this time, during this year, we triangulated this from different data points actually. So, households that were, targeted by this activity showed slightly less than 4% decline in food security situation when it is compared to non-targeted communities. So you can clearly see an intentional effort to bring in different dimensions as well as, investments that are looking at multiple aspects of maintaining the system as well as responding in a way that we are not compromising what we have been building. It also helps to build the community's resilience, meaning that the system-based layered approach, in addition to the specific sectors, agro-pastoral, pastoral focus sectors, the focus on other dimensions of, for instance, rangeland management, social cohesion, and other aspects of governance layered together, were able to contribute this kind of result in that kind of setting. Next slide, please.
Good. And if you can close in a couple more minutes, then I'll have time to ask you questions as well.
Yeah, almost there. So one aspect I would like, as a sector, I briefly talked about resilience. I know it's a big concept and it will take us longer than what I said, but I have to show you the snapshot of that in the previous slide. So one thing I just wanted to mention is financial service is critical element of our market systems work, because it is a cross-cutting team. Communities need access to finance. It's part of their coping strategy. Business need finance, so it's multidimensional. Finance is so important. So one of the works which we proudly say in partnership with some of the donors, specifically USAID, is working with the Somali regional state and entrepreneurs. We are able to initiate a process and support the establishment of Somali microfinance institution, which dates back, I say 2011, where we started from the scratch. And this involves navigating from that locality up to the national level, working with the National Bank of Ethiopia, working with the Ethiopian Microfinance Association. You have lots of the partnership. That's what I said earlier. So from the scratch, we're talking at the moment 600,000 plus, clients, and thousands of, probably 1/4, even more than that, are using mobile, platforms. And you can see some of the figures. So what does that work entails? It entails, the technical assistance requirements during the establishment process, helping on that one. And as we talk about, Sharia compliant or Islamic financing, the journey started actually 7 years back. Somali Microfinance is the first one, where we had this exposure visit, taking them to other countries to learn more about that. And Somali Microfinance is a pioneer. So we are so proud to be partnering with them and start that journey. And it is really quite interesting to see what they are achieving at the moment. Potentially 32 plus branches across the region and even outside of the region at the moment. Last slide, please. So the other piece, I think some of our colleagues raised, is what it looks like. Some of the areas where Mercy Corps ventured in more recently following the CRRF, meaning that the Comprehensive Refuge Response Framework, which allows the right to work refugees as well, which started very recently. I can say this is a new entry point for most of us who are doing market systems at the moment. It dates back as maximum 2 years back. So imagine what it looks like in this kind of setting as well. So complex relationship between refugee and host communities, policy and governance issues, to some extent, some are addressed, hugely aid flooded markets, and it's really just at a startup at the moment. Numerous challenges, but we are starting to see few results in some selected targets where refugees were able to engage in some form of production. If I say, for example, in Dolo area where sesame is one of the cash crops, refugees were able to access seeds and supply to local processors. We are seeing also early results where crowding in has also started, but it doesn't mean it's without challenge. We have numerous challenges because we know that it is 2+ decades of continued aid, and market systems in that kind of setting means, so challenging. The question is that, yes, people need aid. I think that the whole conversation, I think, has to be on the how of it. How do we make sure that that aid, while we meet the need at the moment, how can we contribute for transformational change? Good enough, there is this CRRF, or enabling environment is changing. So how do we capitalize on those changes so that we can really, work our way out also and minimize our disincentive to aspiring private sector who want to pop up in that kind of setting as well. So it's quite complex. It's a journey. We just started that in Ethiopian context, as I said, closer now 2 years back. So our approach remains the same as I say. Since time is up, I think I'm 2 minutes plus late. I would welcome questions.
Good, thank you. I'm going to start with some questions from Christian and Nebil, and then I'll have some questions for the panelists more generally. But for you, Melaku, it's a question about the participation of the private sector in market systems development. So how do you involve the private sector in what you do?
Thank you, Adam. I mean, yeah, in the first place, I mean, everybody, I hope in this room agrees, private sector is the engine of growth. Now, the question for us is, we are looking at the people, or termed as beneficiaries earlier by Ben. We don't call beneficiaries at Mercy Corps actually. We call something else. I don't want to get into the detail, but private sector engagement is critical. And what matters most is also what are the sectors we are looking at and how proper those sectors are. So private sector development is not necessarily equal to market systems development because there are so many, enabling environments and the sector we are selecting and all those kind of things. So the engagement takes a wide range of, entry points, as I mentioned, earlier on the how part. What are the incentives and the capacities for private sector to engage in this kind of setting? Where is our leverage point? Are we looking at middle level entrepreneurs who are present in those localities, invest there and connect them with big, market outlets or suppliers? Or I think it's critical to look at where our entry or leverage point is in this kind of setting. That's what we learned from our work in this kind of setting. But on the why part, obviously, you can have million reasons. Sustainability, scale, the amount of resource you can leverage from private sector by working with them, and continued transaction and the work beyond the lifespan of the program. So the tactics, as I said, again, vary, and it takes also different and sequenced approach in settings like the ones I mentioned, because thin markets, you may want to focus on multiple supporting functions and rules of the game, or rules and regulations. So you may not be just focusing on one aspect or two aspects in a better of markets, but here you really need to focus on so many aspects of the supporting functions, because the markets are so thin and are not really working. So it's quite a work, but at the heart of it is private sector.
Good, thank you. So let's bring in some other panelists. Can the other panelists please turn on your cameras? Nebil and Ben. Okay, so the first question I wanted to ask comes from several people in different ways, but I think it was most clearly given by Julia. And Julia kind of says that in a thin market where you don't have a huge amount of private sector kind of existing, it can be difficult to find a firm that is capable of developing new business models and providing a demonstration approach. I think this is quite linked to a question from Hailey about what is the size of the incentive that you need and how do you calibrate that incentive to the context you're working with. And Asagid and Zudu also ask, how do you work with in a context where a lot of people are expecting handouts or expecting NGOs to come and give stuff rather than work in a market systems approach? So there's a bunch of questions around incentives and how can you influence the incentives of organizations in Ethiopia. Maybe I can start with you, Nebil, and then go to Ben.
Very happy to pick up on that. It's a good question. The thin markets, there are also markets that we've worked in where there is no market yet. For example, we worked in mobile banking for several years where there were no transactions yet. There was no markets. And we were getting into all sorts of issues around how are we incentivizing firms to invest and get into the market without necessarily changing too much or skewing too much the incentive. And the first thing to recognize is that there is really two phases. There is a phase of free market where a lot of work does need to happen around capacity building for there even to be a market in the first place. And I think one of the things we often forget is we think there's a market where there's no market or a very thin market, and the rules are different in those different times. But when it comes to incentives, it's a really interesting question. And I think the main point I want to emphasize on incentives is that there are all sorts of incentives. There are financial incentives and there are non-financial incentives for businesses. Businesses look at all sorts of things, social incentives, strategic goals. So we often tend to think about incentives as financial incentives, and if we give a grant, what does that do, and so on. But I think we need to really broaden sometimes our definition of what are firms really incentivized by, and how does that change over time, and broadly to sort of put as much on the table and to sort of really think about sort of what are we sort of think businesses operate to make profit, and therefore it's just about the money, and that's a very narrow way of looking at basically their incentive set. But actually businesses, like people, have all sorts of incentives and all sorts of motivations, sometimes conflicting with each other, and having a good analysis and understanding of that, I think, often gives you more tools and instruments to be able to influence.
Great, thanks, Nebil. Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I would echo some of those things. I think it is too easy a cop-out in a lot of cases to talk about, I'm not sure if that's a particularly British phrase, but every market is thin. We're working in development, right? It's a continuum of thinness. And in a good market systems program, you select what you do based on the pre-existing market conditions. You don't wish it was a different way. You don't say, oh, why is no one sort of, growing a particular crop in the Somali region? Well, they're not, right? We don't need to make them do that. They do something else down there. So I think you design your program around what's possible. There is also an extent to which you can, it's Julia's question. Julia is currently taking our excellent training course. And there is an example within that where we talk about the tactical differences for a program in trying to expand into different regions. So there is an example from Bangladesh where the kind of conditions on which you engage your initial partners are very different to when you're saying we need to expand to this geography where markets are thinner, where resources are lower. So you may give them more support financially, perhaps, because the risk is higher in them going there. So it doesn't mean you need to find someone who's already there. You can take them with them. In Liberia, there was no investment advisory capacity locally. So we just went to a different country and said, how about you sort of bring the model that you've got here? How about you try it out in Liberia? We'll give you technical advisory support to establish the business and things like that, but you bring the skills. And so there is, if you kind of design your intervention and your program around what's possible, and then also expand your scope of what you think can be done, bringing in resources from elsewhere, then I think that's a good thing to do. Just one thing on incentives. I think Nebil is 100% spot on that you need to consider the complexity of incentives. And that is both at an organizational level, but we often forget that organizations don't make decisions, people make decisions. And if I ask you, why do you do your current job? And people might say instantly the reaction is for the money. But if I offered you a 1% pay rise, would you change your job? Probably not in the majority of cases, because you like the people, you like the lifestyle, you don't like change or whatever it is. So, and businesses are just the same. They're run by people, and not just businesses, government. And so you have to consider that incentive is not what we give people. Incentive is inherent. And so what we're trying to do is leverage the incentives that people have with the intervention that we do to try and yield a different outcome. And our incentive is a developmental one. Theirs might not be, but it might be. And as long as we can make them align to achieve a common goal, then that's the kind of objective of our intervention.
Great, good, thanks, Ben. Melaku or Maurice, do you want to add to that question? Or should we go to the next?
Well, maybe a practical example. We are pushed by regional government. We work a lot in Oromia to do direct delivery. And at some point, a number of our cooperatives, so with the regional government, made us invest in upgrading of storage, warehouses, roofs of storage. And as much as we initially didn't want it, we ended up doing it anyhow. And later on, those warehouses allowed us to experiment with warehouse lending receipt. So based on so farmers place their items in that warehouse, the warehouse stores it for a while and sells it at a much better price later on in the season. And it became a very successful product for the MFI and the cooperative, the cooperatives involved, that started somehow accidentally with a direct delivery. And maybe it just illustrates that as long as you keep on, let's say, thinking about how you can move forward, adapting yourself, there's always a way to get into a sustainable activity, even though it may start with direct delivery. Just wanted to give you that example.
Thanks a lot. And Melaku, I'm going to ask you to start us off on our final question. And this is again a summary of a lot of questions which were about like kind of design in a donor context. So several people asked, how do you work with relatively small short projects? So Debella asked, how is MSD relevant for a 2 to 3 year project? Timrat asked a similar question, that if impact takes 5 to 8 years and a donor grant is 3 to 5 years, how do you run an MSD project? And I think Adisu got at a similar question, asking how do we integrate MSD in a program? And Tekla Mariam asked about flexibility. So within a standard project, how do you have the flexibility to do everything we've been talking about? So I guess the question is kind of, how does market systems development fit in for kind of project-based work, which we are all kind of familiar with? So Melaku, can you start? And then I might go to Nebil, and that might be all we have time for.
Thank you, Adam. Great questions. I think one key aspect, obviously, we have focused very much on what is happening out there, but we have to look also inward, where how our institutional DNA is changing in a way that we are in a position to run market systems, program, our recruitment, our operations, our finance, policies, and how we also develop our strategy. For good or bad, I mean, we all know the business model is project-based, multiple donors, different projects. I think the whole idea is, do we have that strategy and vision where we think in a longer term, and then we articulate and try to plug in different pieces of investments in a way that they are taking us to that journey. So if we are sticking everything to that time bound, and as it is presented in a specific project, then it will be another show of piecemeals of projects, one after the other. So I think those internal mechanisms, how we are envisioning and what change we are trying to make internally as an organization, plus the longer term perspective. Because from the examples I mentioned, the EUTF community, this comprehensive, after the comprehensive refugee response, framework came in, started very recently, but we are not starting from the scratch. We are building from the years of investment, where we know where some of the private sectors came to leverage on that to be able to help new participants or beneficiaries through the new investment, meaning you can clearly see the link and the interconnection in that regard. So we are not starting from the scratch. So it really requires, much easier said than done, but there are numerous factors. But at the end of the day, those internal organizational aspects, including our strategy and vision, are really critical. But unfortunately, in some of the areas, a year, 2 years, time is not really enough.
Completely agree. Thank you. And Nebil, this will be the final word.
Yeah, just building on what Melaku said, even if you have a 2-year program, I think it's really important to recognize what has come before you in terms of other work that you can build on, but also what will come after you, because we have to deliver results within our project timeframe. But we're all in this sector knowing that, projects start, projects and new ones come and so on. And if it could be more like a relay where the next project picks up the baton from the last project, in a 2-year, 3-year, we're not going to just, sort of create all these sustainable things that will just happen on their own. It will require that continuity and consistency. So we do have to really think about exit strategies from day one. And we have to build on what has started. So just to give an example, we have results to deliver. We understand that, but at the same time, we do have to keep on our horizon. Who are the other development partners in this area? Who is potentially, working to sort of come in? And as a program, I mean, EP, for example, we facilitated the design of future programs that have picked up on EP interventions and have carried it on in further years, so that we can kind of really cement some of the gains that have been made and scale up some of the early successes that we've been able to have beyond these sort of realities of project timeframes. So what I would say is it's really good stakeholder analysis over time is going to be critical to even short-term projects.
Great. Okay, so we come to the end of our hour and a half. I should say, firstly, thank you to everybody for your very active participation. We've had, I think, over 60 questions in this time, which is a new record for a webinar I've been part of. So thank you for that. Thank you to Linda for organising the webinar and putting together so much of the administration, which makes it happen. And thank you to our presenters for their very insightful presentations on MSD in Ethiopia. We are going to, as a follow-up, we're going to make the recording and hopefully the presentations available to everyone. Enterprise Partners is also developing case studies and will be developing more webinars talking in more detail about specific interventions. So yes, that is it from me. Unless I've missed anything, panelists.
Thank you, Adam, as well, for your hosting.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone, and thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.